Let us pray. Eternal and everlasting God, help our minds and our thoughts and our feelings, giving us insight and retentiveness as we read. Help us to see theology and its wider connections to math, science, history, psychology, law, medicine, and other spheres. Help us to be shaped by your omnipotent work in us in accordance with thy infallible and holy word. Amen. Well, we are with Bishop Gilbert Burnet in his History of the Reformation of the Church of England. The last time we were in Book 1, which gives a summary of Henry's reign until the opening of the divorce, or technically the annulment. Henry came to the throne in 1509, and in 3 years the treasury was in the red. Coming off the Lancaster-Yorkist Civil War, a male heir was important for national unity. France, Spain, Portugal, Rome, Germany, and England, all intentions. Emperor Maximilian died on 12 February 1519, and the youngster Charles V becomes emperor on 5 July 15. The emperor comes to England 26 May 1520. Wolsey, of course, is angling for the papacy. Leo X has died on 1 December 1521, with Adrian VI rising for his short rule from January 1522 to 14 September 1523, roughly 17 months. Clement VII comes to the throne on 19 November 1523. Charles besieges Rome, keeping the Pope prisoner for months. 6 May 1527. Meanwhile, we hear a review of Cardinal Wolsey's ascent to the cardinalship. In Chancellor's role, a man having the French pox and a live-in housekeeper, and a most skilled and intentional sycophant, playing to Henry's vanity, as did others. Wolsey was Bishop of Tournai, Lincoln, and York. At one time or another, he held both Bath and Wells, St. Albans Abbey, and Winchester. One wonders about the interplay between Archbishop Warham and Bishop Rochester, notably in the engagements in the few parliaments of the first 20 years of Henry's dominion. Warham appears to have been more retiring. Henry VII raised both sons, Arthur and Henry VIII, in scholarly ways, something popularized by the Italian Medicis. Henry VIII was raised in the Old Divinity and enjoyed reading Aquinas' Latin Summa. Bishop Gilbert notes that had Henry VIII died before the Catherine events of 1529, he might have been canonized as a loyal son and saint of the Church of Rome. Meanwhile, Dr. Cranmer is the Don of Cambridge throughout all these shenanigans, political. Ecclesiastical immunities from civil courts becomes a conflicted and contested issue. It's debated in Convocation and Parliament. Hun, an alleged Wycliffite owning a Wycliffite Bible, hanged in prison, occasions the larger debate. It was alleged as a suicide, but an inquest showed a homicide. He'd been in the Lollards prison at St. Paul's under ecclesiastical arrest. But who should be accountable and where? Those of the bishop's household, a royal court, or ecclesiastical court? Londoners were unhappy about the burning of Hun's body at Smithsfield and the cover-up for the bishop's boys. The king is conscious of this tug of war between the temporals and the spirituals. On 11 October 1521, the Pope, in a pompous letter, made Henry Defensor Fidei. Burnet tells us that Henry was prouder of this title than all his other titles. One is reminded of Napoleon's comment that men lived to have ribbons and medals as the result of military service. On 10 June, Wolsey got a papist bull to reform the monasteries, 1519. Wolsey was hated, we're told, by the clergy. The cardinal was proud, Polydorus Virgil, 633. Wolsey designs to visit all monasteries and is conceiving of refashioning and refounding monasteries as bishoprics, cathedrals, collegiate churches, and colleges. Wolsey, as the Legantine authority, begins to call convocations, and Warham complains of the intrusion of his authority. Winchester and Rochester hated the cardinal. The cardinal's proposed new colleges at Oxford and Ipswich appealed to Henry, who loved learning. Burnet refers to Wycliffism throughout the nation. Burnet says he translated the Bible out of Latin into English with a long preface before it in which he reflected severely upon the clergy and condemned the worshiping of saints and images, denied corporal presence of Christ in the cannibalist way in the sacrament, and exhorted all the people to the study of scriptures. There was widespread sympathy with Wycliffe, but support went underground and went unspoken. After parliamentary and royalist Richard II, Henry IV measures against it, as well as cruel measures adopted on the continent against Wycliffism. In 1400, the preamble of the English papes and apes and drapes against English Wycliffism, passed by the Parliament in connection with Henry IV in the second year. Quote, that some had a new faith about the sacraments of the church and the authority of the same, and did preach without authority, gathered conventicles, taught schools, wrote books against the Catholic faith, with many other heinous aggravations, upon which, against the Catholic Church, the prelates and clergy and the commons of this realm prayed the king to provide a sufficient remedy to so great an evil. Therefore, the king, by the assent of the states and other discreet men of the realm, being the said parliament, did ordain that none should preach without license except persons privileged, that none should preach doctrine contrary to the Catholic faith or the determination of the Holy Church, and that none should favor or abet them, and that if any persons were defamed or suspected of doing against that ordinance, then the ordinary might arrest them and keep them in his prison till they were canonically purged of the articles laid against them, or did abjure them according to the laws of the church, provided always that the proceedings against them were publicly and judicially done and ended within 3 months after they had been arrested. If they were convict, the diocesan or his commissaries might keep them in prison as long as to his discretion shall seem expedient, and might fine them as should seem competent to him, certifying the fine into the king's exchequer. And if any being convict did refuse to abjure, or after abjuration did fall into relapse, then he shall be left to the secular court according to the holy canons. And the mayors, sheriffs, and bailiffs were to be personally present at the passing the sentence when they should be required by the diocesan or his commissaries, and after the sentence they were to receive them, and then before the people in a high place to be burnt. By this statute, the sheriffs and other officers were immediately to proceed to the burning of heretics without any writ or warrant from the king. But it seems the king's learned counsel advised him to issue out a writ de heretico comburendo, Burns takes a tour of numerous Lollards tried in the 1400s, most abjuring, some not. Burnet does a 150-year flyover at 300,000 feet. We would interject Prof. David Daniels' salubrious and helpful note that England, of all of the European countries and nations, was the most abusive and singularly cruel in relation to Lollard and vernacular Bibles, even more vigorous than the hateful Spaniards with their infamous Inquisition and Rome, its parental originator. Archbishop Warham and London's Fitzjames, 1509 to 1519, have episcopal registration entries against the heretics with their standard Lollard objections. 1400 preamble gives strong hints that Wycliffism was strong among the clergy, school teachers, and others. Burnet gives the impression that Luther was nearwise late to the game. Charges against Lollards were often hyped with other charges, notably from the clerical side. Occasionally, the civil court saw through the ruses, ruling that the person was in error, not in heresy. Tyndale's books in 1526 were arriving, and that excited Thomas More to take the pen in hand, with London's license to read heretical literature. Longland of Lincoln was notoriously vicious against the Lollards and Lutherans. The king, craving a name in his imperialism and with his aspirancy to utter autocracy and supremacy, appoints his staff to write a standard workup on the seven sacraments, with More as the sorter of the materials, but not the writer of the volume. Henry gets an attaboy from the sinner in Rome. The English apes and papes and drapes enthused to the book, especially the lapdog clergy. We now turn back to continue our work here. That was a review from last time. When reports were brought to a court of a company that were in Cambridge, Bilney, Latimer, and others that read and propagated Luther's books and opinions, some bishops moved in the year 1523 that there might be a visitation that would go to Cambridge for trying those who were favorers of the heresy there. But he, as legate, did not inhibit it. Upon what grounds, I do not know, says Burnet, which was brought against him afterwards in Parliament. Yet when these doctrines were spread everywhere, he called a meeting of all the bishops and divines and canonists about London, where Thomas Bilney and Thomas Arthur were brought before them, and articles were brought in against them. The whole process is set down at length by John Fox in all points according to Tunstall's Register, except one fault in the translation. When the Cardinal, Wolsey, asked Thomas Bilney whether he had not taken an oath before not to preach or defend any of Luther's doctrines, he confessed that he had done it, but not judicially, judicialiter in the Register. This Fox translates not lawfully. In all other particulars, there is an exact agreement between the Register and the Acts. The sum of the proceedings of the court was that after examination of witnesses and several other steps in the process, which the Cardinal left to the Bishop of London and the other bishops to manage, Bilney stood out long and seemed resolved to suffer for a good conscience. In the end, what through human infirmity and through great importunity of the Bishop of London, who set all his friends on him. He did abjure on the 7th of December, as Arthur had done on the 2nd of that month. Though Bilney was relapsed, and so was expected no mercy by law, yet the Bishop of London enjoined him penance, the sacrament of penance, and let him go. For Tunstall, being a man both of good learning and an unblemished life, and a gentler sort compared to Longland of Lincoln, these virtues produce one of their ordinary effects in him, great moderation, that was so eminent in him that at no time did he dip his hands into the pool of blood, like Bloody Bonner would. Geoffrey Loney and Thomas Gerard also abjured for having had Luther's books and defending his opinions. So what a takeaway is, Luther's books are in country. It doesn't mention what language they're in. He's known by the Cambridge people. And we pretty sure Cranmer is quietly following this as a sensitive weathercock or a sensitive weather vane. These were the proceedings against heretics in the first half of this reign. And thus far I have cut open the state of affairs both as to religious and civil concerns for the first 18 years of this king's time, with what observations I could gather of the dispositions and tempers of the nation at that time, which prepared them for the changes that followed afterwards. This is the end of Bishop Gilbert's first book. And we now move to part 1 of book 2 of the process of the divorce between King Henry and Queen Catherine, and of what passed from the 19th to the 25th year of that reign. 25th would put it when? 1534. Are we right on that? The 19th would be 1528. Getting our sea legs here. King Henry hitherto lived at ease and enjoyed his pleasures. He made war with much honor, and that always produced a just and advantageous peace. He had no trouble upon him in all his affairs except for getting money. And even at that, the cardinal eased him. But now a domestic trouble arose which perplexed all the rest of the government and drew after it consequences of a high nature. Henry VII, upon wise and good considerations, resolved to link him in close confederacy with Ferdinand and Isabella, Spaniards, kings of Castile and Aragon, and with the house of Burgundy against France, which was looked on as the lasting and dangerous enemy of England. And therefore a match was agreed upon between his son, Prince Arthur, and Catherine, a political marriage. The Infanta of Spain, whose eldest sister, Joan, was married to Philip, that was then Duke of Burgundy, an Earl of Flanders, of which arose a triple alliance between England, Spain, and Burgundy against the French king. There was given with her 200,000 ducats, the greatest portion that had ever been in the ages with the princes, any princes, which made it not the less acceptable to King Henry VII. The Infanta was brought to England, and on the 14th of November was married to St. Paul's, to the Prince of Wales. They lived together as man and wife till the 2nd of April. and not only had their beds solemnly blessed when they were put in it on the night of marriage, but also were seen publicly in bed for several days after, and went down to live at Ludlow Castle in Wales, where they still bedded together. But Prince Arthur, through a strong and healthful youth when he married her, died soon after, which some was hastened by his too early marriage. The Spanish ambassador had, by his master's order, taken proofs of the consummation of the marriage and sent them into Spain. The young prince also himself had, by many expressions, given his servants to believe that his marriage was consummated the first night, which in a youth of 16 years of age that was vigorous and healthful was not at all judged strange. It was so constantly believed that when he died, his younger brother, Henry, Duke of York, was not called Prince of Wales for some considerable time. Some say for a month, some say for 6 months. And he was not created Prince of Wales till 10 months were elapsed, when it was apparent that his brother's wife was not with child by him. These things were afterwards looked on as a full demonstration that the princess was not a virgin after Prince Arthur's death. But the reason of state still standing for keeping up the alliance with France, and King Henry VII having no mind to let so great a revenue as she had in jointure be carried out of the kingdom, it was proposed that she should be married to the younger brother Henry, now Prince of Wales. The two prelates that were in the greatest esteem with Henry VII were Warham, Archbishop of Canterbury, and Fox, Bishop of Winchester. The former delivered his opinion against it and told the king that he thought it was neither honorable nor well-pleasing to God. The Bishop of Winchester argued for it, and for the objections that were against it and the murmuring of the people who did not like a marriage that was disputable, lest out of it new wars should afterwards arise about the right of the crown. The Pope's dispensation was thought sufficient to answer it all. And his authority was then so undisputed that it did it effectually. So a bull was obtained on the 26th of December 1503 to the effect that the Pope, according to the greatness of his authority, having received a petition from Prince Henry and Princess Catherine bearing that whereas the princess was lawfully married to Prince Arthur, which was perhaps consummated by the carnalis copula, was dead without any issue, but they being desirous to marry for preserving the peace between the crowns of England and Spain, did petition his holiness for this dispensation. Therefore the Pope, out of his care to maintain peace among all Catholic kings, did absolve them from all censures under which they might be, and dispensed with the impediment of their infinity, notwithstanding any apostolical constitutions or ordinances to the contrary, and gave them leave to marry. Or if they were already married, he, confirming it, required their confessor to enjoin them some healthful penance for their having married before the dispensation was obtained. It was not much to be wondered at that the Pope did readily grant this, for though very many cardinals and divines did then oppose it, yet the interest of the papacy, which was preferred to all other considerations, required it. For as that Pope, being a great enemy to Louis XII, the French king, would have done anything to make an alliance against him firmer. So he was a warlike Pope who considered religion very little, and therefore might be easily persuaded to confirm a thing that must needs oblige the succeeding kings of England to maintain the papal authority, since from it they derive their title to the crown, little thinking that by secret direction of an overruling providence that deed of his would occasion the extirpation of the papal power in England. Nice turn, twist, and sense of consciousness by Bishop Burnet. So strangely doth God make the devices of men become of no effect, and turns them to a contrary end, which is intended. Upon this bull they were married, the Prince of Wales being yet under age. But Warham had so possessed the king with an aversion to this marriage, that on the same day that the prince was of age, he, by his father's command, laid on him in the presence of many of the nobility and others, made a protestation in the hands of Fox, Bishop of Winchester, before a public notary, and read it himself, by which he declared that whereas he, being under age, was married to the Princess Catherine, yet now coming to be of age, he did not confirm that marriage, but retracted and annulled it, and would not proceed in it, but intended in full form of law to void it and break it off, which he declared he did freely and of his own accord. This is Henry Protests, June 27, 1505. Then it stood during his father's life, who continued to the last to be against it. And when he was just, he charged his son to break it off, though it is possible that no consideration of religion might work so much on him as the apprehension he had of the troubles that might follow upon the controverted title to the crown, of which the wars between the houses of York and Lancaster had given a fresh and sad demonstration. The king being dead, one of the first things that came under consultation was that the young king must either break his marriage totally or conclude it. This is April 22, 1509. Henry VII dies, and Henry comes to the crown. Being come to the crown, marries her June 3. They are crowned June 24, and a son is born January 1, 1511. Arguments were brought in by both hands, for those it prevailed most with the king. So 6 weeks after he came to the crown, he was married again publicly, and soon afterward they were both crowned. On the first day of the year, she made him a very acceptable New Year's gift of a son, but he died in February thereafter. She miscarried often, and another son died soon after he was born. Only the Lady Mary lived into her 40s. I forget the exact date, but she died young also. In this state was the king's family when the king and queen left, bearing more children, and contracted some diseases that made her person acceptable to him, but was, as to her other qualities, a virtuous and grave princess, much esteemed and beloved both of the king and the whole nation. Lady Mary was born February 1516. The king, being out of hopes of more children, declared his daughter Princess of Wales and sent her to Ludlow to hold her court there and projected divers matches for her. The first was with the Dauphin, which was agreed to be between the King of France and him on the 9th of November 1518, as appears by the treaty at extant. But this was broken afterwards upon the king's confederating with the emperor against France, and a new match agreed and sworn to be between the emperor and the king at Windsor on the 22nd of June, 1522, the emperor being present in person. This being afterwards neglected and broken by the emperor, by the advice of his courtiers and states it was formerly related, there followed some overtures of a marriage with Scotland, but those also vanished. And there was a second treaty begun with France, the king offering his daughter to Francis himself, which he gladly accepting. A match was treated, and on the last of April it was agreed that the Lady Mary should be given in marriage either to Francis himself or to his second son, the Duke of Orleans, and that the alternative was to be determined by the two kings at an interview that was to be between them soon after at Calais, with forfeitures on both sides if the match was not on. But while all of this was in agitation, the Bishop of Tarbes, the French ambassador, made a great demur about the Princess Mary's being illegitimate, as begotten in marriage that was contracted against a divine precept, with which no human authority could dispense. How far this was secretly concerted between the French court and the English court, or between the cardinal and the ambassador, is not known. It is surmised that the king or the cardinal sat on the French to make this exception publicly, that so the king might have a better color to justify his suit of divorce, since other princes were already questioning it. For if upon a marriage proposed of such infinite advantage to France as that would be the heir of the crown of England, they nevertheless made exceptions and proceeded but coldly in it. It was very reasonable to expect that after the king's death, other pretenders would have disputed her title in another manner. To some extent, it seems strange that the king did offer his daughter to such great princes as the emperor and the king of France, to whom, if England had fallen in her right, it must have been a province. For though in the last century with France she was offered either to the king or to his second son, by which either the children which the king might have by her, or the children of the Duke of Orleans should have been heirs to the crown of England, and thereby it would have continued divided from France. Yet this was the full hazard. For if the Duke of Orleans, by his brother's death, should become king of France, as it afterwards fell out, or if the king of France had been once possessed of England, then according to the maxim of the French government, that whatever their king acquires, he holds it in the right of his crown, England was still to be a province to France, unless they freed themselves by arms. Others judged that the king intended to marry her in France, the more effectually to seclude her from the succession, considering the aversion his subjects had to a French government. While all this was going on, the treaty went on. The king's scruples about his marriage began to take vent. It is said that the cardinal did first infuse them into Henry, and made Longland Bishop of Lincoln, that was the king's confessor, possessed the king's mind with them in confession. If it was so, the king had, according to the religion of that time, very just cause of scruple when his confessor judged his marriage sinful, and the Pope's legate was of the same mind. It is also said that the cardinal, being alienated from the emperor, that he might irreparably embroil the king and him, and unite the king to the French interests, designed this out of spite, and that he was dissatisfied toward the queen, who hated him for his lewd and his dissolute life, and had often admonished and checked him. We have a footnote. In a manuscript life of Sir Thomas More, wrote not many years after Longland's death, this account given. I have heard Dr. Draycott, that was Longland's chaplain and chancellor, say that he once told the bishop what rumor ran, and desired to know of him the very truth, who answered that in very deed he did not break the matter after that sort as is said, but the king brake the matter to him first, and never left him, urging him until he had won to give him his consent, of which his doings he did sore forethink himself, and repented afterward. So the queen, chastising the cardinal, and that therefore designing to engage the king to marry the French king's sister, the Duchess of Lincoln, did, to make way for that, set this matter on foot. But as I see no good authority for all this except the queen's suspicions, who did afterwards charge the cardinal as the cause of all her trouble, so I am inclined to think that the king's scruples were much older and ancient. Or got a letter here, reference to Bucer, September 10, 1531. I'm inclined were much, and for the king declared to Simon Grenius 4 years after this, he will be a key player. And for 7 years he had abstained from the queen upon these scruples, so that by that it seems they had been received into the king's mind 3 years before this time. What were the king's secret motives? The true grounds of his aversion to the queen is known only to God. Until the discovery of all the secrets at the day of judgment, they must lie hid. But the reasons which he always owned, of which all human judicatories must only take notice, shall be now fully opened. He found by the law of Moses, if a man took his brother's wife, they should be childless. This made him reflect on the death of his children, which he now looked on as a curse from God for this unlawful marriage. Upon this he set himself to study the case, and called for the judgments of the best divines and canonists. For his own inquiry, Thomas Aquinas, being the writer in whose works he took most pleasure, and to whose judgment he submitted most, did decide it clearly against him. We both concluded that the laws in Leviticus about the forbidden degrees of marriage were moral and eternal, such as obliged all Christians, and that the Pope could only dispense with the laws of the Church, but could not dispense with the laws of God. Upon this reason, that no law can be dispensed with by any authority but that which is equal to the authority that enacted it. Therefore, he infers that the Pope can indeed dispense with all the laws of the Church, but not with the laws of God, to whose authority he could not pretend to be equal. But as the king found this from his own private study, So, having commanded the Archbishop of Canterbury to require the opinion of the bishops of England, they all in writing, under their own hands and seals, declared it an unlawful marriage. All bishops, except Fisher, declared it unlawful. See Cavendish's Life of Wolsey. Only the Bishop of Rochester refused to set his hand to it. And though the Archbishop pressed him most earnestly to it, yet he persisted in his refusal, saying that was against his conscience, upon which the Archbishop made another write down his name and set his seal to the resolution of the rest of the bishops. But this being afterwards questioned, the Bishop of Rochester denied it was his hand, and the Archbishop pretended that he had to leave given by the bishop to put his hand to it, which the other denied. Nor was it likely that Fisher, who scrupled in conscience to subscribe it himself, would have consented to such a weak artifice. But all the other bishops did declare against the marriage. And as the king himself said afterwards in the Legantine court, neither the cardinal nor the Bishop of London did first suggest these scruples, but the king, being possessed with them, did in confession propose them to that bishop, and added that the cardinal was so far from cherishing them that he did all that he could to stifle them. The dangers that were to follow from this. The king was now convinced that his marriage was unlawful, both by his own study and the resolution of his divines. And as at the point of conscience wrought on him, so the interest of the kingdom required that there should be no doubting about the succession of the crown, lest as the long civil war between the houses of the York and the Lancasters had been buried with his father, so that no one should rise up at his death. The King of Scotland was the next heir to the crown after his daughter. And if he married his daughter to any of the French, then he had reason to judge that the French, upon their ancient alliance with Scotland, and that they might divide and distract England, would be ready to assist Scotland in his pretensions. Or if he married her in France, then all those in England to whom the French government was hateful, and the emperor and other princes to whom the French power grew formidable, would have been as ready to support the pretensions of Scotland, or if he should either set upon his bastard son or the children which his sister bore to Charles Brandon, there was still cause to fear a bloody decision of a title that would be doubtful. And though this may seem a consideration too politic or foreign to a matter of that nature, yet the obligation that lies on a prince to provide for that happiness and quiet of his subjects was a weighty thing, that it might well come in among other motives to incline the king much to have this matter decided. At this time, the cardinal went over to France, made under color to conclude a league between the two. This is France, July 11, 1527, and to treat about the means of setting the Pope at liberty, who was then in the emperor's prisoner at Rome in the Casale de San Angelo, and also for a project of peace between Francis and the emperor. But his chief business was to require Francis to declare his resolutions concerning the alternative about Lady Mary, to which it was answered that the Duke of Orleans, as a fitter match in years, was the French king's choice. But this matter fell to the ground upon the process that soon followed after. the king's fears and his hopes. The king did much apprehend the opposition the emperor was like to make to his designs, either out of principle of nature or honor to protect his aunt, or out of a maxim of state to raise his enemy all the trouble he could at home. But on the other, he had some cause to hope well, even in this particular. The question of the unlawfulness of the match had been first debated in the Cortes, or Assembly of the States at Madrid, and the emperor had then himself shown himself favorable to it, and he broke the match to which he bound himself with the princess. Therefore, the king had reason to think that this was at least would mitigate his opposition. The emperor had also used the pope so hardly that it could not be doubted that the pope hated him, and it was believed that he would find the protection of the King of England most necessary to secure him either from the greatness of France or Spain, who were fighting for the best part of Italy, which must needs fall into one of their hands. Therefore, the king did not doubt but the Pope would be compliant to his desires. In all of this, he was much confirmed by the hopes or assurance which the cardinal gave him of the Pope's favor, who, either calculating what was to be expected from that count on account of their own interest, or upon some promises made to him, had undertaken to the king to bring that matter about to his heart's content. It is certain that the cardinal had carried over with him out of the king's treasure £240,000 to be employed about the king's liberty. But whether he had made a bargain for the divorce or had fancied that nothing could be denied him at Rome, it did not appear. It is clear by many of his letters that he had undertaken to the king that the business should be done, and it is not like that a man of his wisdom would have adventured to do so, and that without good warrant. But now that the suit was to be moved in the court of Rome, there were some to devise such arguments as were like to be well heard there. It would have been unacceptable to have insisted on the nullity of the bull on this account, because the matter of it was unlawful and fell not within the Pope's power. For popes, like other princes, do not love to hear the extent of their prerogative disputed or declined, and to condemn the bull of a former pope as unlawful was a dangerous precedent at a time when the pope's authority was rejected by so many in Germany. Therefore, the canonists as well as the divines were consulted to find such nullities in the bull of dispensation as, according to canon law, and the proceedings of the Rota might serve to invalidate it without any diminution of the papal power. Which being once done, the marriage that followed upon it must needs be annulled. When the canonists examined the bull, they found much matter to proceed upon. It is a maximum in law that if the Pope be surprised in anything, and bulls be procured upon false suggestions and untrue promises, they may be annulled afterwards. Upon which foundation most of all the processes against the Pope's bulls were grounded. Now they found by preamble of this bull that it was said the king had desired that he might be dispensed with to marry the princess. This was false, for the king had made no such desire, being of an age that was below such considerations, but 12 years old. Then it appeared by the preamble that this bull was desired by the king to preserve the peace between the King of England and Ferdinand and Isabella, called Elizabetha in the bull, to which they accepted that it was plain this was false, since the king, being then but 12 years old, could not be supposed to have such deep speculations and so large a prospect as to desire a match upon a political account. Then, it being also in the bull that the Pope's dispensation was granted to keep peace between the crowns, if there was no hazard or any breach or war between them, this was a false suggestion, by which the Pope had been made to believe that this match was necessary for the aversion of a greater mischief, and it was that there was no danger at all in that. So this bull was obtained by a surprise. Besides, both King Henry of England and Isabella of Spain were dead before the king married his queen, so the marriage could not be valid by virtue of a bull that was granted to maintain amity between princes that were dead before the marriage was consummated. And they also judged that the protestation which the king made when he came of age did retract any such pretended desire that might have been preferred to the Pope in his name, and that from that time forward the bull could have no further operation, since the ground upon which it was granted, which was the king's desire, did then cease any pretended desire before he was of age, being clearly annulled and determined by that protestation after he was of age, founded upon the bill, must needs be void. Wolsey's advice to the king, August 1, 1527. These were the grounds upon which the canonists advised the process at Rome to be carried out. But first, to amuse or overreach the Spaniard, the king sent word to his ambassador in Spain to silence the noise that was made about him in that court. Whether the king had then resolved on the person that should succeed the queen when he had obtained what he desired or not is much questioned. Some suggest that from the beginning he was taken with the charms of Anne Boleyn, and that all this process was moved by the unseen spring of that secret affection. Others will have this amour to have been later in the king's thoughts. How early it came there at this distance, it is not easy to determine. But before I say more of it, she being so considerable a person in the following relation, I shall give some account of her. Sanders has assured the world that the king had a liking to her mother, who was the daughter to the Duke of Norfolk, and to the end that he might enjoy her with the less disturbance, he sent her husband, Sir Thomas Boleyn, to be the ambassador in France. He came over and sued a divorce against her in the Archbishop's court. But the king sent the Marquis of Dorset to let him know that she was with child by him, and that therefore the king desired he would pass the matter over and be reconciled to his wife, to which he consented. And so Anne Boleyn, though she went under the name of his daughter, yet was of the king's begetting. As he describes her, she was ill-shaped and ugly, had 6 fingers, a gag tooth, a tumor under her chin, with many unseemly things in her person. At the 15th year of age, he says, both her father's butler and chaplain lay with her. Afterwards, she was sent to France, where she was at first kept privately in the house of a person of quality. And she went to the French court, where she led such a dissolute life that she was called the English Hackney. That the French king liked her, and from the freedoms he took with her, she was called the King's Mule. But returning to England, she was admitted to the court, where she quickly perceived how weary the king was of the queen and what the cardinal was designing. And having gained the king's affection, she governed it so that by all innocent freedom she drew him into her toils, and by the appearances of a severe virtue with which she disguised herself, so increased his affection and esteem that he resolved to put her in the queen's place as soon as the divorce was granted. The same author adds that the king had likewise enjoyed her sister with a great deal more, to the disgrace of this lady and her family. I know it is not the work of an historian to refute the lies of others, but rather to deliver such a plain account as will be more effectual confutation than anything that can be said by way of argument, which belongs to other writers. And at the end of the king's reign, I intend to set down a collection of the most notorious falsehoods of this writer, together with the evidences of their being so. But all of this of Anne Boleyn is so palpable a lie, or rather a complicated heap of lies. And so much depends on it that I presume it will not offend the reader to be detained a few minutes in the refutation of it. For if it were true, very much might be drawn from it, both to disparage King Henry, who pretended conscience to annul his marriage for the nearness of affinity, and yet would after that marry his own daughter. It leaves also a foul and lasting stain both on the memory of Anne Boleyn and of her incomparable daughter, Queen Elizabeth. It also derogates so much from the first reformers, who had some kind of dependence on Queen Anne Boleyn, that it seems to be of great importance for directing the reader in the judgment that he is to make of persons and things, to lay open the falsehoods of this account. It was sufficient for blasting it that there is no proof pretended to be brought for any part of it, but the book of one Rastall, a judge, that was never seen by any other person than that writer. The title of the book is The Life of Sir Thomas More. There's great reason to think that Rastall never writ any such book, for it is the most common for the lives of great authors to be prefixed to their works. Now this Rastall published all More's works in Queen Mary's reign, to which if he had written his life, it is likely he would have prefixed it. No evidence, therefore, being given for his relation, either from record, letters, or the testimony of any person who was privy to the matter, the whole is to be looked upon as a black forgery, devised on purpose to defame Queen Elizabeth. For upon her mother's death, who can doubt but that some, either to flatter the king or to defame her, would have published those things which, if they had been true, could be no secrets. For a lady of her mother's condition to bear a child 2 years after her husband was sent out of England on such a public employment, and the process thereupon to be entered into the archbishop's courts, are things that are not so soon to be forgotten, and that she herself was under so ill a reputation, both in her family, father's family, and in France, for common lewdness and for being the king's concubine, are things that could not lie hid. And yet, when the books of the archbishop's courts, which are now burnt, were extant, it was published to the world, and satisfaction offered to everyone that would take pains to inform themselves that there was no such thing on record. Nor did any of the writers at that time, either of the imperial or papal side of things, once mention these things. notwithstanding their great occasion to do it. But 80 years after the fable was invented, or at least it was then published, when it was safer to lie because none had lived in the time to disprove it. But it has not only no foundation, but Sanders, through the vulgar errors of lies, has stained his wit to make so ill a story of the lady that some things in his own relation make it plainly appear to be impossible. And here we'll draw this section of Bishop Gilbert to a close. Glory be to the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Amen.